Guess what we're going to go over in this lecture? Did you say an important point? Yeah, you're right. Okay, take a look at this statement. If John is not teaching logic, then both Xander and Andrea are sad. If we're going to represent this statement symbolically, the first thing we have to do is identify all of the simple statements that comprise the compound statement. And when we start looking through this, we can see here's one statement, John is not teaching logic, which we could represent affirmatively as John is teaching logic. And then we see down here kind of sneakily, we have two simple sentences kind of embedded together or meshed together. We have Xander is sad and Andrea said, okay? So we can use these three statements as our simple statements to represent this compound statement. Now, in order to figure out what operators we're going to need to look really closely for words that indicate particular operators. I see right off the bat an if-then statement. That tells me there's going to be a horseshoe involved here. And I also know that whatever follows the word if is going to go on the left-hand side of the horseshoe, and whatever follows then is going to go on the right-hand side of the horseshoe. Now, I also see here this word and, which is joining up this simple sentence, Xander is sad, and this simple sentence, Andrea is sad. And conjoins things. So I know I'm going to be using a conjunction, a dot in my translation. Okay, so when I symbolize this sentence out, I might wind up with something like this. If John teaching logic is represented by J, then tilde J represents John is not teaching logic. And this is the way this sentence seems to read. If it is not the case that John is teaching logic, or if John is not teaching logic, then Xander is sad and Andrea is sad. Fair enough. But here's the problem. The rule of Wolff's requires that there can only be one operator other than tilde outside of parentheses and outside of brackets, which we'll get to later. And I can see here I've got three operators. One of them is tilde, but two of the others are not tilde. We've got a horseshoe and we've got a dot. And this rule says there can be only one operator other than tilde outside of parentheses and brackets. So I can have a statement like this, where I've got one operator inside parentheses and one operator outside of parentheses. That's fine. I could even have a statement like this where I've got tilde outside of parentheses and a dot outside of parentheses, because the rule says there can only be one operator other than tilde outside of parentheses and brackets. Okay? I could also have something like this where I've got a horseshoe outside of parentheses and a tilde outside of parentheses. That's perfectly fine. What I can't have is this. So I'm going to have to use parentheses and brackets to group simple statements together anytime I have more than one operator other than tilde outside of parentheses and brackets. And the tricky part about doing this is to figure out what gets grouped with what. Okay? So we might look at a couple of different possibilities here. We might group up J and Z, or we might group up Z and A. And what we have to determine is, well, which of these groupings seems to best reflect the original statement? Sometimes that's going to be really hard. Other times, though, we're going to find cues in the original statement that tell us things. So if we look back at this original statement, this seems to say something about what happens as a result of John not teaching logic, or John not teaching logic implies something. It implies both Xander and Andrea are sad. In other words, these two things are conditions that come into existence if John is not teaching logic. Okay? Now, if we look at our two possible translations right here, what this one says is this. If John is not teaching logic, then Xander's sad. And Andrea's sad. But it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with John not teaching logic. It's just, and Andrea's sad. But this translation says this. If John is not teaching logic, then Xander is sad and Andrea is sad. And that, I would argue, better reflects this original statement, where we have these two things happening as a result of the first thing happening, Andrea and Xander becoming sad because John is not teaching logic. And so we group those two statements up together. Now, with this in mind, take a shot at this one. If Electronic Arts and Activision sells extremely violent video games, then either Colt or Smith & Wesson can expect increased profits. Okay. Why don't you go ahead and pause your video and take your best swing at this one. You're going to have multiple simple statements, and you're going to have multiple operators outside of parentheses and brackets that are going to require you group statements up using parentheses, okay? So take your best shot at this. I mean, this is a challenge. Enjoy it. When you're ready to check your work, go ahead and restart your video. All right, how many simple statements did you find? You found Electronic Arts sells extremely violent video games, yeah? You found Activision sells extremely violent video games as well, didn't you? Did you also find that Colt can expect increased profits? And did you find that Smith & Wesson can expect increased profits? Because if you did, you located all of the simple statements that make up this big compound statement. So then the question is, well, how do we represent this thing symbolically? And again, we dive back into the original to see if we see anything that points at particular kinds of operators. And I see, once again, we've got an if-then statement. That tells me there's going to be a horseshoe involved in here at some point. But I also see that I've got this connective and, which indicates conjunction. That's going to translate as a dot. So I know there's going to be a dot in here. I also see this word either down here, either or. That's the wedge indicator. So I know there's a disjunctive statement in here. There's an either or statement. And when I write all of these statements out on one line, I might come up with something like this. E dot A horseshoe C wedge S. Okay? I've got 3 operators outside of parentheses and brackets, and the rule of woofs says you can only have 1 operator other than tilde outside of parentheses and brackets. So I'm going to have to group stuff up. And I would argue to you this, that what this original statement is saying is that if these 2 companies do this thing, then either one of these other companies is going to experience something. In other words, I think that E and A should be grouped up, and I think C and S should be grouped up with parentheses, leaving just the horseshoe as the operator other than tilde outside of parentheses and brackets. And now what this statement says is this. If Electronic Arts sells extremely violent video games and Activision sells extremely violent video games, then either Colt is going to see increased profits or Smith & Wesson is going to see increased profits. And that's exactly what this original says.